Hello, and welcome to Musings on History. I'm your host, Dana, and I'm a lover of history, obviously, and also anthropology, religion, sociology, and pretty much everything else that attempts to make sense of our existence. I used to have a podcast by the same name, and I decided to switch to the YouTube format and provide some visuals because that's the way people learn nowadays. I hope you enjoy my content and maybe learn some things. This first series is a historiography of some of my favorite Shakespeare plays, and as the title suggests, the first play I'll be discussing is The Tempest. A Farewell to the Stage. William Shakespeare is probably the best known author in the English language. He was born on 23 April 1564 in Stratford upon Avon, and he also died on 23 April 1616 in Stratford upon Avon. And during his lifetime, he wrote 39 plays, 154 sonnets, and 3 long narrative poems. There are some other writings that are reputed to be his, but for now, we'll stick with what we can verify. Most people associate William Shakespeare with the famous Globe Theatre, which still exists today, but in fact, he did not own the Globe Theatre, and some of his plays, including The Tempest, were not shown there first or at all. Shakespeare was actually part owner of the Chamberlain's Men, one of many prominent playing companies in Elizabethan London. A playing company was the term for an acting troupe, and this playing company had exclusive rights to perform all of Shakespeare's plays, which makes sense because he was part owner. The patron of the Chamberlain's Men was Henry Carey, 1st Baron Hunsdon. Henry Carey was the son of Mary Boleyn and William Carey and was thus Queen Elizabeth's maternal first cousin. And he was Queen Lizzie's Lord Chamberlain, which is why Shakespeare and his business partners honored him by naming their playing company after him. When Lizzie kicked the bucket in 1603 and King James VI of Scotland took the English throne and became King James I and VI of England, Scotland, and Ireland, Shakespeare and his partners renamed the playing company to the King's Men. Very subtle, William. But art has always been both personal and extremely political, especially in England during this time. Shakespeare was born during the Edwardian phase of the English Reformation, and he lived most of his life during the Elizabethan phase, which most historians consider to be the end of the English Reformation. Life for the children of Henry VIII, Mary, Edward, and Elizabeth was a series of, you're illegitimate. Actually, no, I changed my mind. You're illegitimate. No, wait, I changed my mind again. You're illegitimate. And so for Lizzie especially, public demonstrations of loyalty were very important and were richly rewarded, and William Shakespeare did not fail to comprehend this. In fact, Shakespeare's histories concerning the Wars of the Roses, which begin with Richard II and end with Richard III, have the ulterior motive of burnishing the reputations of Lizzie's Lancastrian forebears and villainizing her Ops ancestors, like her Yorkist cousins or the remaining Plantagenets in continental Europe. By 1611, when The Tempest was first performed for King James and his daughter Elizabeth on the occasion of her betrothal to Frederick of Bohemia, William Shakespeare had outlasted most of his peers and was a legend in his own time. The Tempest follows the basic format of the medieval morality play, which is a genre of play that features personified concepts like virtue and grace struggling alongside the protagonist against vice and sin. It was a common occurrence for such plays, also called masques, to be performed for young women as they embarked on marriage. Now, political animal that Shakespeare was, he had to have understood the pressure of performing a brand new play for a brand new monarch. The political winds had changed, a new dynasty was on the throne, and England and Scotland were ruled in personal union for the first time in history. But Shakespeare was old by now and probably not interested in courtly intrigue and currying royal favor, and so The Tempest is considered to be his farewell to the stage and to public life. The Tempest. The protagonist of The Tempest is the erstwhile Duke of Milan, Prospero. At the beginning of the play, he spent the last 12 years living on a Mediterranean island inhabited by an exotic and unchristian creatures, including this guy, Caliban, a savage and half-human monster, and the child of the witch Sycorax, and Ariel, a spirit. Ariel and Caliban are enslaved through magic by Prospero, but where Ariel is patient, long-suffering, and dutiful, Caliban feels as though Prospero has cheated him out of his birthright, it being the island itself and the magical books that Prospero uses to enslave him and Ariel and the other spirits of the island. Those books had originally belonged to Caliban's mother, Sycorax, and when Prospero first arrived on the island, Caliban had shown Prospero how to survive. Also marooned on this island is Prospero's daughter Miranda, who has managed to thus far maintain her virtue in this savage and heathen climate, no thanks to Caliban, who, when his offer of marriage was rebuffed by Prospero, then threatens to rape Miranda and populate the island with little Calibans. What a charming man. Prospero's unscrupulous brother Antonio had deposed him, forcing him to flee into exile, and Antonio was assisted in this by the king of Naples, Alonso. Prospero continually laments that he has to use magic, not because he thinks slavery is a moral cancer, but because he's a Christian and Christians shouldn't use witchcraft. But he has had to adapt to his heathen environment in order to survive. And even though Caliban was nice enough to show him the ropes, Prospero acts like he had no other choice but to become Doctor Strange, Slave Master Edition. From Caliban, we learned that Sycorax was originally from Algiers, but was banished to the island, and before Prospero and Miranda arrived, she was the only fully human inhabitant since Caliban is half something. Much like Prospero does years later, Sycorax used her magic to survive on the island. However, her knowledge of magic and use of it was considered black magic and viewed as a bad thing that she only did for power. Using Ariel as a spy, Prospero learns that his brother Antonio, Alonso, the king of Naples, and the king's brother Sebastian, as well as his son and heir Ferdinand, are all on a sea voyage. He uses magic to cause a storm that wrecks them all on the island in different places, along with the king's jester, Tronculo, and his drunken butler, Stefano, who serve as comic relief in the play. Prospero had recently banished Caliban from his service because Caliban had attempted to rape Miranda, and so Caliban's searching for both revenge and a new master, which he thinks he finds in Tronculo and Stefano. Caliban calls Stefano his new god and master and rebuffs Ariel as she tries to convince him to rebuke his new masters and not go along with their schemes, which are to kill Prospero and steal Miranda. To demonstrate to Caliban how unworthy Tronculo and Stefano are, Ariel puts fancy clothes in their path as they are attempting to kill Prospero, and it makes them forget about the entire plot. When Caliban sees this, he's distraught and realizes that they're not a proper fill-in for Prospero, and so Caliban returns to Prospero and begs for a chance to be a better slave to him. Prospero used magic to cause the storm, but he deeply regrets that he has to do this. He arranges for he and Miranda to find Ferdinand alone, which Prospero believes will make Ferdinand grateful to him and also encourage a romantic relationship to start between Ferdinand and Miranda. This is all part of his plan to eventually regain his dukedom. King Alonso of Naples, King Alonso's brother Sebastian, Prospero's brother Antonio, and King Alonso's counselor Gonzalo, as well as some other guys, are all shipwrecked in another part of the island, and the crew in yet another part, but the crew is curiously asleep until the end of the play. Antonio, Prospero's brother, and Sebastian, Alonso's brother, have been conspiring to kill Alonso and Gonzalo so Sebastian can become king of Naples, which is similar to what Antonio and Alonso did to Prospero 12 years prior. Ariel, who acts as Prospero's spy and as a personification of the moral conscience in this play, thwarts the conspiracy at Prospero's command. And then, in the guise of a harpy, Ariel confronts Antonio, Alonso, and Sebastian about their perfidy, which causes them to go temporarily mad and flee in guilt for not only their most recent scheming, but how they plotted against Prospero 12 years ago as well. Meanwhile, Prospero is putting on a mask or a morality play for Miranda and Ferdinand after Ferdinand does propose marriage to Miranda, which must have been very meta for the Princess Elizabeth watching this in Whitehall Palace in 1611. Prospero commands the other spirits on the island to play characters like the Roman goddess of marriage Juno, the Roman goddess of agriculture and motherhood Ceres, and the Roman messenger of the gods Iris, who all bless the betrothal. In the play, the goddesses instruct Miranda and Ferdinand to remain chaste until marriage so they can ensure a healthy family life, one that will unite the thrones of Milan and Naples. Prospero then interrupts the mask when he realizes that he still has plots against his life, and he orders Ariel to deal with Caliban, Tronculo, and Stefano, and then he tells Alonso, Sebastian, and Antonio that while he does forgive them, he will be blackmailing them. Throughout the play, Prospero continues to lament that he has to use magic to get his throne back, And he vows to break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. And he even promises to free Ariel after she gives him good winds to sail back to Milan or Naples, or I guess to take Alonso Ferdinand and possibly Miranda back there. After doing this, Ariel is set free while Caliban remains Prospero's slave, albeit a chastened one. At the final curtain, Prospero then addresses the audience directly and asks them to free him with their applause. Themes of the Tempest. Prospero being analogous to Shakespeare is obvious, given his last line about being freed from the audience via their applause. But Prospero is also analogous to King James in certain ways as well. Certain themes in The Tempest, including family betrayal, the temptations of witchcraft and magic, political intrigue, and the morality and necessity of slavery and colonization, mirror the reign of King James. James I and VI of England, Scotland, and Ireland was the only son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Queen Mary was famously executed by Queen Elizabeth I for repeatedly plotting to overthrow Liz, but she's also less known for her earlier attempt to retake the Scottish throne as James' regent after the Scottish Parliament forced her to abdicate in December 1452 in favor of her infant son. Queen Mary's illegitimate half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, was appointed as baby James' regent. In 1568, Queen Mary escaped from Lochleven Castle, raised an army, and fought Moray at the Battle of Langside, which she lost. After her defeat, she escaped to England, where Queen Elizabeth kept her first under confinement and then imprisonment because she kept plotting against the Queen, eventually leading to her execution in 1587. A year prior, in 1586, James and Elizabeth had signed the Treaty of Berwick, which acknowledged James as Elizabeth's heir to the throne of England. Lose a mother, gain an additional throne, all in a day's work for James Stuart. For those wondering, though, the only thing James had to say about his mother's execution was that it was a preposterous and strange procedure, not because his cousin was killing his mother, but because he felt it was a strange situation for Elizabeth to be in, a queen having to kill a fellow queen. What a lovely family. James was married by proxy to Anne of Denmark in November 1589, and because of the terrible weather, they spent the first year of their marriage in Oslo, Norway. In a rare fit of romantic chivalry, when Anne's ship from Denmark to Scotland was blown off course to Norway, James boarded a ship to retrieve her, and then they both ended up stuck in Norway for the better part of a year, waiting for any of the ships that sailed from Scotland to retrieve him, to make it actually across the tempestuous North Sea. All in all, 3 ships were sunk just trying to get the couple back to Scotland. While in Norway, King James developed an interest in studying witchcraft. Now, what they called witchcraft back then is what we would consider homeopathy right now, and both then and now, most practitioners of homeopathy were women. When these women studied homeopathy, it was witchcraft, and it led to things like the North Berwick witch trials of the 1590s, which James attended, and where several women were accused and then executed for the crime of sending storms against James's ships. Now, everyone knows that Northern European waters, in particular in the North Sea, are treacherous in the fall and winter. The Venerable Bede wrote in the 600s AD that Norse raiders would plan their raids around the season so as not to get caught in a fall storm trying to get back to Scandinavia. But sure, James, it was witches. Not the same predictably chaotic storms that sunk the Spanish Armada. Witches. King James' interest in what he called demonology was so intense that he wrote a book on it called Demonology in 1597. In the book, he admits to performing certain rituals and being in contact with other men who perform rituals, but he explained his involvement by saying that he needed to understand the craft of the enemy, and generally carried on like he was doing this amazing yet spiritually taxing work that everyone needed to thank him for. And this sounds a lot like Prospero heavy sighing every time he was forced to use magic to enslave spirits in Caliban and manipulate situations to his advantage. Of course, it never occurred to either Prospero or King James that maybe Sycorax and the women of Scotland, respectively, were also using magic to improve their lives or for intellectual curiosity's sake. And so these women died for doing the same things that men got away with. It's also worth noting that the North Berwick witch trials were a big influence on Shakespeare's Macbeth. So this was something that King James was really, really into, and I don't think Shakespeare failed to see the hypocrisy in his actions. But whether he did or not, he couldn't very well write a play that was critical of the king and then perform it right in front of his salad. So Prospero is characterized as a noble man who just wants to do his Christian duty, but he's forced to use magic so he can regain his throne. Still, I think Shakespeare does manage to criticize King James throughout the play. For instance, while the combined efforts of Caliban, Trinculo, Stefano, Antonio, and Alonso are all convailing on Prospero to take his life, he's busy writing, directing, and producing a play to guilt trip his teenage daughter into remaining a virgin until marriage. King James also had a pretty tenuous grasp on his reign, both in Scotland and later in England. Before he'd even come into the majority to rule Scotland in his own name, there had been several plots against his life and even an assault on his person in public. And in England, there was the very famous Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when the dissident Catholic Guy Fawkes was discovered underneath the Parliament building on the 5th of November with tons of explosives, the night before King James was to open the second session of English Parliament. James was aware of the fact that he was beset on all sides by enemies, even attributing his eventually pretty long reign to a combination of luck and providence. Yet historians note that James was usually pretty sluggish and timid in his response to these attempted coups, especially where it concerned his opposition in the Scottish Parliament, who did not want the Scottish Kirk merging with the Anglican Church. James seemed to get the memo that he had better keep that monarch as the head of the church and that Book of Common Prayer out of Scotland. If only his son and grandson had gotten that hint. And yes, I know that the HBO miniseries on the Gunpowder Plot was not very good, but I decided to use this picture of Kit Harington because one, he's gorgeous, and two, he's directly descended from people on both sides of the Gunpowder Plot. It just goes to show that nothing brings a family together like domestic terrorism and regicide. This is very similar to Prospero surviving first the attempt on his life by his brother Antonio and Alonso, and then surviving Caliban's attempt on his life aided by Trinculo and Stefano, only to forget that he still needed to deal with them so he could organize a wedding play. Prospero even says, "I had forgot that foul conspiracy of the beast Caliban and his confederates against my life. The minute of their plot is almost come." And it's just kind of strange to me how you could just forget that multiple somebodies want to kill you. And King James also used to try and divert his attention from the plots on his life. There were two in the first year of his reign in England alone, and still James found time to go hunting. I imagine his court found it kind of odd as well that he would respond to a whole coup by going hunting, but everybody has their coping mechanisms, I guess. King James was raised as a devout Calvinist in the Church of Scotland, but as part of the Treaty of Berwick, he was also assumed to be the head of the Church of England as the monarch as well. James, who had already tried without success to assert monarchical control over the Church of Scotland, wanted to unify the churches with himself as the head of both, but neither the Scottish nor the English were having that. James often lamented that he couldn't be an autocrat since he saw it as the only way to truly rule the way God intended for him to do so. And his son would soon find out the hard way that autocracy was dead in England. But the similarities don't end there. Shakespeare was a master at using subtle and sometimes not so subtle character and plot progression to signal his political stances. Both Prospero and King James use forgiveness to their advantage. Prospero saves King Alonso's life, forgives him for helping Antonio 12 years prior, and marries his only child to Alonso's son and heir, thereby gaining a powerful ally in Milan and a spy in Duke Alonso's court through Miranda. He also has the benefit of having a good relationship with Ferdinand, so if Alonso ever forgot which side his bread was buttered on, a better ally was waiting in the wings already. King James also attempted to use marriage to gain a powerful ally via the Spanish match. He wanted to heal the decades worth of beef between Spain and England by having his son Charles marry the Spanish Infanta Ana Maria. At the time, the precious metals of Spain's possessions in America and the vast continental European holdings of Anna Maria's grandfather, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had made Spain the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. King James, who wanted to continue Queen Elizabeth's patronage of English trading companies and privateers, did not want to have Spain as an enemy. James was also perennially broke, and Spain was very rich, and he knew that Anna Maria's dowry would fix all his money problems since the English Parliament was so stingy. Yet another issue he died without fixing, much to his son's downfall. Unfortunately for King James, the Spanish match was not as successful as Prospero's plan to marry Ferdinand and Miranda, and Prince Charles ended up marrying Princess Henrietta Maria of France instead. Colonization and slavery are also themes in The Tempest that have historical significance to King James' reign. English exploration and colonization of the Americas really took off during his, with the colony of Jamestown being founded in 1607 and the colony of Virginia by the London Company. Virginia was named for Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, but no English settlements in Virginia were permanent until Jamestown. Some historians have suggested that The Tempest expresses Shakespeare's alleged anti-colonial and anti-slavery sentiments through the character of Caliban, but personally, I don't see it. The name Caliban is a play on the word cannibal, which is what many Europeans thought the indigenous were. Shakespeare also describes Caliban as a half-human monster, meaning Sycorax had procreated with someone inhuman to produce Caliban, which is a racist dog whistle that even a deaf man could hear. Instead, I see Shakespeare as an early English slavery apologist via the characterization of Prospero. Prospero is presented as a moral Christian man who only uses magic to try and Christianize the spirits and Caliban, and he even demands that Caliban be more grateful to him for teaching him civilized language. Caliban then brings up the fact that through his mother, the island belonged to him first, and when Prospero and Miranda first came ashore, Caliban taught them what they needed to survive, and Prospero spoke highly of Caliban back then, only to take the knowledge of magic and Caliban's goodwill and use both to enslave everyone on the island. Prospero then calls Caliban a liar for pointing this out and is never challenged on it again, which essentially gives a rubber stamp to Prospero's actions. This is reminiscent of how the earliest settlers in North America would not have survived, including the settlers of Jamestown, if it hadn't been for the indigenous that the settlers later massacred and whose land they then stole. Personally, the characterization of both Prospero and Caliban lets me know that Shakespeare was a man of his time, and he felt that Europeans were doing something noble by colonizing the Americas. These were the prevailing thought processes of this time period, although the way history is taught, William Shakespeare seems so far away from colonization, but in fact, he's contemporaneous with it. It began in the middle of his life, so it's not surprising that he would have had opinions on it and expressed these opinions through his work. The Tempest is thus a professional send-off for Shakespeare and a signal of his tacit approval of the reign of King James I, which was still in its early years by 1610 when Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. I don't really understand why he felt the need to write something so congratulatory when he knew he was going to be retiring right after, but perhaps, like Caliban and Prospero, Shakespeare had found the leader he was looking for in King James. Lizzie did lose some of her public favor towards the end of her life, and Shakespeare was critical of her in some of his other works, which I'll get into in another episode. Shakespeare could have seen the reign of King James as being exactly what England needed. Next episode, I'll be discussing Shakespeare's longest play, Othello, the Moor of Venice. Join me next time for more Musings on History.